The Supreme Court of the United States just told Donald Trump his tariffs are illegal. Not some of them. The sweeping global tariff regime that defined his entire economic agenda struck down 6-3. And two of the justices who voted against him, he appointed them himself. Within hours, Trump signed a new executive order. By the next morning, he raised it again. Not because he had a plan, because he had nothing else. If this kind of analysis matters to you, subscribe and hit the like button. It makes a real difference. Let's break down what actually happened and what it means. On Friday, February 20th, the Supreme Court ruled that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority opinion. Justices Gorsuch and Barrett, both Trump appointees, sided with the majority. Only Thomas, Kavanaugh, and Alito dissented. This was not a technicality. This was the constitutional backbone of Trump's trade war, snapped in half. Every single reciprocal tariff from Liberation Day, the sweeping levies on allies and rivals alike, the emergency powers invoked to bypass Congress, all of it illegal. The court didn't hedge. It didn't offer a compromise. It said, this power belongs to Congress, period. And Trump's response told you everything you needed to know. He called the decision ridiculous. He called it poorly written. He called it extraordinarily anti-American. He said he was absolutely ashamed of the justices who ruled against him, including two he personally put on the bench. He even claimed that foreign interests have a lot of influence over the Supreme Court. This is not the language of strategy. This is the language of someone who just lost control.
In a Truth Social post, he wrote, based on a thorough, detailed and complete review of the ridiculous, poorly written and extraordinarily anti-American decision on tariffs issued yesterday. He says, I, as President of the United States, will be effective immediately, raising the 10% worldwide tariffs on countries to the fully allowed and legally tested 15% level.
A thorough, detailed, and complete review. That's what Trump called it. A review that took him exactly one night. The Supreme Court deliberated for months. Trump responded in hours, first with a 10% global tariff, then bumped it to 15% before breakfast the next morning. That is not deliberation. That is damage control dressed up as defiance. And the instrument he reached for reveals just how much ground he lost. Under IEEPA, Trump had unlimited power. No cap on tariff rates. He imposed 35% on some countries, 50% on others, 125% on China at one point. No time limit, no need for congressional approval. It was the closest thing to unilateral economic warfare a president could wage. Now, he's operating under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974.
Now, these tariffs, these legally tested tariffs, what he can do is the maximum is 15%. That is the maximum he can do, and they last for 150 days. If he wants to extend them, Congress needs to do that. So there are limitations to these tariffs that were not in place on the previous tariffs. And this is an executive order that he signed under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974.
15%, 150 days. And then he needs Congress. Compare that to what he had before. Unlimited rates, unlimited duration, no congressional oversight. Trump didn't downgrade his weapon. He went from a cannon to a water pistol. And he's pretending it's an upgrade. But here's the part that makes his position even weaker. Congress has already shown it's willing to vote against him. Last week, before the Supreme Court even ruled, the House of Representatives voted to overturn Trump's IEEPA tariffs on Canada. 3 Republicans broke ranks: Don Bacon, Thomas Massie, and Kevin Kiley. They voted with every single Democrat. And after the Supreme Court ruling, Bacon didn't just celebrate, he predicted what comes next. He said that if Trump pushes his new 10% global tariff, it will be brought up for a vote in Congress, and it will be defeated. His words, "It may not have a veto-proof majority, but it will have a majority that will go against that 10% overall tariff." Senator Rand Paul put it even more bluntly. The Supreme Court makes plain what should have been obvious. The power to impose tariffs is very clearly a branch of the power to tax. This is not just a legal setback. The fracture is inside Trump's own party. The same Republicans who enabled his trade war for over a year are now publicly drawing the line. Bacon compared Trump's tariff policy to Herbert Hoover, the last Republican president who championed tariffs. That comparison is not a compliment. Hoover's tariffs helped deepen the Great Depression, and the financial fallout from this ruling could make the political problem even harder to contain. Here's a number that should keep the White House up at night. $175 billion. That's the estimated total in refunds the U.S. government may owe to importers who paid IEEPA tariffs that the Supreme Court has now declared illegal. The estimate comes from the Penn-Wharton Budget Model, a nonpartisan research group at the University of Pennsylvania. U.S. Customs had already collected over $133 billion in IEEPA tariffs as of mid-December. The ruling didn't address refunds directly, but companies aren't waiting for clarity. Costco, Toyota, Peloton, GoPro, Crocs, Barnes & Noble. Hundreds of companies had already filed lawsuits before the ruling even came down. They wanted to be at the front of the line, and now that line just got a lot longer. Justice Kavanaugh, in his dissent, warned that the refund process would be, his word, a mess. The Trump administration collected billions in tariffs it had no legal authority to impose, and now it may have to give it all back. The administration that sold tariffs as a revenue machine is staring at the possibility of becoming the biggest debtor in American trade history. So what does all of this mean for Canada?
Now, crucially, the goods under the USMC, the kind of US-Canada-Mexico trade agreement, are not applicable in these, but also there are sectoral tariffs that already exist which are untouched. So things like goods like lumber, like car parts, like steel, aluminium, tariffs on those products still remain for Canada.
The immediate impact for most Canadian exporters? Minimal. Around 90% of Canadian goods exported to the U.S. comply with CUSMA, and those goods are exempt from the new 15% tariff, just as they were exempt from the old IEEPA tariffs. But let's not pretend Canada is out of the woods. The tariffs that have caused the most damage to Canada's economy, the ones on steel, aluminum, automobiles, lumber, copper, were imposed under Section 232. Different law, different legal basis. The Supreme Court ruling didn't touch them. Steel and aluminum still face 50% tariffs. Autos, 25%. Lumber tariffs were hiked to 45%. These are the tariffs that hurt Canadian workers, Canadian manufacturers, Canadian communities. And they're not going anywhere, yet. But here's where the strategic picture shifts in Canada's favor. Under the old IEEPA framework, Trump could threaten to withdraw from CUSMA and slap 35% tariffs on everything. That threat was a loaded gun pointed at Ottawa during trade negotiations. That gun just got unloaded. With IEEPA struck down, pulling out of CUSMA no longer triggers the same catastrophic tariff escalation. Canada's negotiating position heading into the mandatory CUSMA review in July 2026 just improved significantly. As CIBC's chief economist put it, the U.S. has lost leverage. The judicial check on presidential power means Canada now knows there are limits to what any president can impose unilaterally. That doesn't eliminate the threat, but it changes the math, and that's the real story here. This isn't just about tariff rates, it's about the limits of executive power. The Supreme Court, shaped in part by Trump himself, drew a constitutional line. The power to tax belongs to Congress, not to any president, not under any emergency, not under any pretext. Trump can rage on Truth Social. He can call justices a disgrace. He can sign executive orders at midnight and raise rates before dawn. But the era of unlimited, unchecked tariff warfare by presidential decree is over. 150 days, 15%, and then Congress decides. One side spent the last year building alliances, diversifying trade, and strengthening domestic industry. The other spent it attacking courts, insulting judges, and scrambling for legal workarounds. Canada didn't just survive this tariff war, it positioned itself for what comes next, not through rhetoric, through preparation. If you found this breakdown valuable, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to understand what just happened. The conversation doesn't end here.